I call the Honourable Member for Bowman.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and there can be few more important topics for us to be debating in this great chamber than the quality of education and schools in this country. So I welcome the opportunity, and while this bill addresses some relatively minor measures, it is an opportunity to review what's been achieved by the Coalition over the last 12 months. And I want to acknowledge the previous speaker with her extensive experience presenting her point of view to the chamber. Although I was a little disappointed, I would have liked a little more detail regarding her concerns around curriculum review, because it would have been a good opportunity for her skills and background to be more elaborated in this chamber, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. What I did manage to divine from her comments, in essence, was that she did not support a review of the curriculum, thinking that it wasn't required. B, a sense that it's really all about the how and not about the what, which I think for which most people would probably disagree. And then finally, a very sort of veiled criticism of the current Education Minister, saying that he was in some way not devoted to the task, a comment that even some of his most virulent opponents would probably struggle to sustain. No, today's really, in essence, about the arrangements that are made for Indigenous boarding initiatives to make sure that schools, mostly non-government schools that take large numbers of Indigenous students, are appropriately compensated through the system. And secondly, to look after the special schools and special assistance schools that faced, without these amendments today, a potential fall in their funding in 2015. But those two relatively minor elements of the overall education picture does open up a door for me to examine how we are performing in Indigenous education in general. And I made the observation 2 years ago with the ABS population data of indigeneity that we were in many cases failing, Deputy Speaker, to tease out two cohorts within Indigenous Australia's population. The first are the predominantly urban Indigenous Australians who are living surrounded in many cases by opportunity but unable to access them, and that represents about 2/3 of Australia's Indigenous population. And then the 100,000, or even more, correction, probably more so 5/6, and then the 100,000 Indigenous Australians living remotely. Now they have completely different outcomes. They follow a completely different life course, Deputy Speaker, and it would be wrong for authorities, entities, departments and those of us in here to average the two and talk about improvement in Aboriginal outcomes, because I can guarantee that is not the case in remote Australia. And when we come forward today with legislation, our job is to ensure that it supports those remote families just as much as it does those who choose to live in the regions or the cities. So let's talk about some specifics. If you go and visit an East Arnhem community of 1,000 people today, you will find that less than 5% of children finishing school go on to find a job. 5%. If you visit an average community in Northern Territory, just 15% of the community, of the Aboriginal community, have a job. 1-5. And all of those jobs, bar none, are public sector jobs, funded by the taxpayer. So I've made this observation before. We have created a remote Australia utterly devoid of a private sector, and the only place in the world where that is the case. And through our systems we have created the virtual absence of a service economy, bar publicly funded services that are dropped onto or into communities. That's right, there's virtually no inter-Aboriginal service economy. There's no payment for services. So in a context of goods and services where there's no services, all you can do with your money is purchase goods. And that is at the heart of the dysfunction that we see when we visit. Imported rubbish, food and a few other items that are trucked in is pretty much the only thing one can spend your money on. And until we have a more developed system of opportunity in communities, there will be not much connection through the education system to drive ambition and to drive connectedness. And I thought Noel Pearson put it so well, Deputy Speaker. He said, we have a future where we can walk in two worlds as Aboriginal Australians, the Aboriginal world and the mainstream. And in fact, when you think about it, they have a preeminent place because they can walk in two worlds, unlike mainstream Australians who cannot. So there's the challenge, that young Aboriginal Australians can aspire to succeed in both worlds. And the Pearson argument, of course, is that the best way to succeed in both of those worlds is to be literate and healthy, with a functional family structure. And I would add to that that there is no need to be tied and anchored to land in order to love it. As long as you can be the custodian of that land, for some part in your life journey, it involves leaving. And this is the element of the Indigenous Boarding School Initiative. The realisation that just like people all over the world who don't live in major tertiary centres, At some time you need to leave your small town to fulfil your life, to gain an education and experience in order to return it to the community where you're born. I mean, that makes complete sense to the rest of the world. But no, here in remote Australia, mainstream Australia has decided that that's not what Aboriginal Australians want. But you need, I think, to talk to families. Of course they want to make sure that they are close to their loved ones. They want to be close to seniors in the final years of their life, like everyone. And they want to know that if there's cultural obligations, that they can get back to their communities. But beyond that, they are just like everyone else in the world, loving of their family and looking for opportunity for their young ones. They are no different to anyone else. So let's work about creating the opportunities. So I've said one thing very clearly and for a very long time, and that is that the greatest human rights violation in this country, the greatest human rights violation is not sending your children to school. And as long as we have roughly 50% of Aboriginal Australians going to school, we have a massive problem. Not for one moment to say that quality isn't important, but a child not turning up to school is getting 0% quality. And we need to have those little kids sitting in seats in order to drive the political obligation to educate them well. Where those children don't go to school, you can understand a state or territory government saying there's only 20 kids in that class, not 40, we'll only give them one teacher, not two. And the funding is withdrawn because the children aren't in the classroom. Deputy Speaker, attendance is everything, and I'm delighted the Coalition Government is 100% focused on that task. So when we look at education reform, we've acknowledged teacher quality, principal autonomy, parental engagement, and the quality of the curriculum. And I think the work by Kevin Donnelly and Ken Wiltshire in not ripping up and starting again, no, looking at the curriculum that was an honest piece of work by the previous government and simply saying there can be some modest but significant changes to make it even better. It was almost universally applauded, Deputy Speaker, by both sides of that ideological spectrum. They need to be congratulated and not talked down like they have been by my previous speaker. Donnelly and Wiltshire, thank you. You made the obvious observation that sustainability and Indigenous Australia are vital parts of our curriculum, but it shouldn't be automatically and mandatorily woven into everything we do, because in some cases, Aboriginal history and sustainability are not relevant areas to that part of the curriculum. It belongs where it belongs and it shouldn't be forced where it doesn't. Such a common sense recommendation. And among hundreds of pages of those great suggestions, I think that virtually all of them have been generally agreed by both sides of a very wide ideological spectrum, from the left and the intense views about collectivism right through to those who are insisting on individualism and a free market. Well done to both of those gentlemen who achieved such a breathtaking outcome in the education space. We have obviously a minister who is fiercely engaged in education, and I make the simple point that we will be measured for our time in this chamber today and this electoral term on how well we go with Indigenous Australia. We will be harshly judged if, as occurred with the previous government, we leave the place pretty much unchanged from how we found it. Because that's what happened in Indigenous education over the last 6 years of the Labor government. Now let me answer why that was the case. What we had, of course, was a fear of the remote. And we had a real sense that most political power being centred in cities was where most of the Labor attention was focused. It was very hard to get Labor focus out to remote areas in remote education. The evidence I put to you is the attendance rates at school. It's flatlined. No change, 6 years. And I can guarantee you one thing, that will not be the case under a coalition government. You will see an increase in school attendance because as long as kids aren't at school, they have lost that connectedness to the real economy. Those two key areas at either end of your school experience, the 0 to 5 year issue of getting kids ready, capable, fed, dressed and able to emotionally self-regulate and sit in a classroom, we all know is vital. Just 2 or 3 children can tear a class apart. Imagine having an entire class of children who have auditory inability to even hear a teacher. The solution is not loops and implants and loudspeakers. The solution is to eliminate the ear disease. Once those kids can sit and enjoy class, then we have the luxury of talking about quality. Then we have the luxury of talking about what will engage kids and keep them coming. And the third element of the Coalition's approach is to engage parents. My argument is a simple one. If you're a principal of a school, public or private, you are the CEO, but you have a board of directors. And it's not the board of your private school directors, it's your parents. They're the ones you are answering to. Let's see parents directly engaged, cheek and jowl, in Indigenous communities having a say about what is taught in the curriculum. We have swung too far over the last 10 years, expunging Indigenous language from the curriculum. That was the wrong thing to do. We simply looked at the literacy outcomes, saw that it was poor in Indigenous communities, and we said, it must be the teaching of Indigenous language that's making the English bad. And that was a short-sighted decision. It's rubbish. Educators know a child can learn 2 languages at the same time. A child can speak a language at home and be taught another one at school with no problem. They just have to be fit, healthy, motivated, and actually turning up every day. So let's go from attendance, Deputy Speaker, and this Indigenous boarding initiative is one element of that. Let's go from just turning up to turning up every day, starting at breakfast and being well fed and staying all day, not vanishing after the roll gets called. Make sure they go all day, every week, all year. Make sure there's an appropriate celebration for that achievement. And then finally, make sure that when that time comes and school can offer those children no more, and let's be honest, that's at different ages according to the individual, it is the government's responsibility to connect every one of those individuals to opportunity. If there's one thing we can do in here, Deputy Speaker, we can talk a lot, but the one thing we are ultimately responsible is provision of opportunity. I'm not here to guarantee any sort of outcome, output, other than fundamentally give every individual the opportunity they deserve in a great nation. And we can do that. But at the moment, it's absolutely limited in Indigenous Australia, where, as I've said, 95% of children know there is nothing after graduation. Well, why go to school at all? It's a situation where we haven't even audited the job opportunities within a community to work out what local Indigenous people can do. We haven't even set up the complex arrangements to allow people from Indigenous communities to travel in a fly-in, fly-out arrangement into our regional centres and cities. Doesn't even exist yet. It works in the mining communities but is yet to be adopted. So ultimately these boarding initiatives are the future because they are the segue between a complete education, or as complete as you can get in a remote community where often you only get newly graduated teachers with limited experience, and of course being shipped out and completely expropriating the responsibility for education to an expensive boarding school down the road. Now in the middle there are a range of initiatives that are exciting. We have the opportunity to partner up schools, to have classes travel down, for instance, to a major city, and a reciprocation acknowledging that you can learn a whole heap by going to an Indigenous community as a young mainstream Australian child. These arrangements can be achieved, but we have to think way more creatively about how we promote and support education in remote areas. Look, why have I devoted 95% of my conversation to this? Because that is the ultimate test of our system. It's how it looks after the most disadvantaged. So in this bill, we're looking after the special schools and special assistance schools, making sure they don't go backwards. But the boarding initiative is also extremely promising. But I know one thing. You can't pick out 1 or 2 Indigenous children, dress them up in a fancy private school uniform and say you've succeeded, because you've got another 98 children left behind there with nothing. And those 2 people lifted out of poverty may well have a career in the arts, in sport or academia, but there's nothing left behind for the other 98. And I do have my doubts that a successful Indigenous Australian coming back to the community is going to transform that community. I don't think that's the case. I think we have to look at the denominator and lift everyone in the tide of opportunity and not rely on the stars coming back to tell people there's a better life out there that seems absolutely untouchable and unreachable. So please, I don't want to see too much focus on the stars. We need to have a complete focus on whole classrooms of children. So, in finishing, there is no point educating without opportunity at the end. There is no point educating without parental support, and that will involve engaging parents who have no faith in the education system. But at some point, I rely on the expertise of teachers and attendance officers to bring those parents along at some point in that school year and sit down and listen to their children read for the first time and see the trickle of a tear go down their face as they see their young kids achieving something that they never in their own life managed to. And it's that transforming moment that can happen in the arms of an Indigenous teacher that is why it's so truly special to practice in remote Australia. We can do it one by one with the children. Some of them will be travelling to boarding schools. Others will choose other pathways. But the quality of the education in the community will rely first of all on attendance, second on motivated teachers, third on autonomy for those principles, and finally for equality curricula, something that the Coalition is delivering.